Let's talk about a truth most people don't want to face. Sometimes your absence speaks louder than your presence ever could. We're taught to believe that love is maintained through effort, attention, consistency. And while that's true, there comes a moment when the most powerful move you can make is to disappear. I'm not talking about ghosting. I'm not talking about manipulation. I'm talking about reclaiming your presence, your energy, your worth from a space where it was being taken for granted. Because when you're always available, always answering, always giving, you become part of the background, familiar, expected, and often invisible. But the moment you go quiet, the moment you stop showing up where you're no longer valued, something starts to shift. They notice the messages stop, the support vanishes, the warmth fades, and in that stillness they begin to remember how it felt when you laughed together, when you stayed up comforting them, when you made them feel like they were the only one. Suddenly, every moment becomes a flashback, and now they're the one feeling the echo of your absence. This is not about punishment. This is about power, your power, because the energy you've been pouring into someone who didn't see it. That energy is magnetic, and when it's gone, they feel it. When you go missing, they start remembering everything you brought to their life that they never acknowledged. When you're consistently present in someone's life, your energy becomes part of the everyday rhythm. Your messages, your support, your voice, they become woven into the fabric of their daily experience. Over time, they stop recognizing the value of your presence because it's always there, always accessible, always dependable. That consistency, while powerful, can easily be mistaken for something ordinary. What once felt exciting and appreciated slowly becomes background noise, not because your presence is any less valuable, but because human nature has a way of dulling the impact of anything that's always available. Then something shifts, you go missing, you pull back, not out of spite, but out of necessity. You no longer show up in the same way, not because you don't care, but because you've realized you've been overextending yourself in a space that no longer honors your effort. And suddenly, your absence becomes louder than any words you ever spoke. That void where your voice used to echo, where your laughter used to live, becomes uncomfortably quiet. It forces reflection. It invites realization. Because in your absence, they finally feel the magnitude of what you were consistently giving. Clarity begins to rise. All the things they took for granted, the late night check-ins, the emotional support, the loyalty, the love that never asked for anything in return, those things start flashing back like memories in slow motion. The comfort that came from knowing you were always there, it's gone, and that absence, that space you left behind, starts to haunt them in ways they never expected. It's not just about missing you, it's about finally recognizing what your presence meant. Because while they were living in the comfort of you being around, they weren't thinking about how life would feel if you weren't. This is where emotional contrast comes in. Presence creates comfort, but absence creates clarity. It's easy to forget how much light someone brings into your life when that light is always on. But when the room suddenly goes dark, you become hyper, aware of what you've lost. That's what happens when you go missing. They're not just remembering moments, they're realizing their importance for the first time. And the pain of that awareness cuts deeper than any argument or confrontation ever could. This is why your decision to remove your presence isn't just powerful, it's transformational. You shift the emotional weight, you stop carrying the connection alone, and you allow the other person to finally feel what it's like to live without the energy you so freely gave. That's when growth can begin. Not just for them, but for you too. Because in pulling away, you're not just teaching them a lesson. You're reminding yourself of your own worth, and that's a kind of strength that doesn't need to be explained. It's felt when you go missing, when you pull your energy back from a space that once consumed your heart. It sends shockwaves through the emotional balance of that relationship. What was once predictable is now uncertain. What was once guaranteed is now missing, and that change creates a vacuum that forces the other person to pause and reflect. The truth is, people often confuse your consistency with permanence. They think you'll always be there because you always have been. But the moment you shift, even slightly, their emotional foundation starts to wobble. That's when the remembering begins. They begin to recall how you made them feel, safe, seen, supported, and with every flash of memory, a subtle regret starts to form. Not always out of guilt, but out of realization that you were giving something rare, something rooted in real care, something they didn't know they'd miss until it was gone. They begin to remember the sound of your voice, the kindness in your words, the warmth in your presence. Those little things, the thoughtful texts, the genuine concern, the unconditional support, suddenly take on a new weight. Now they matter more than they ever did when they were being received. The brain has a fascinating way of elevating what it's lost. And when someone goes missing from our lives, especially someone who gave from a place of love, our memory doesn't just recall events, it magnifies meaning. They don't just remember that you checked in on them when they were down. They remember how it made them feel human again. They don't just recall your smile, they remember how it softened the hardest days, and with every memory comes a fresh wave of emotional recognition, not only of who you were to them, but who they failed to be in return. It's in your absence that they start replaying conversations, searching for signs they missed, moments they brushed off, or chances they had to appreciate you more deeply. They begin to connect dots they once ignored. They remember what they said and what they didn't say. They remember when they laughed with you and when they made you cry. They remember everything because the mind, in its effort to resolve what's missing, becomes obsessed with understanding why it feels the way it does. And the deeper they dive into those memories, the more they confront one undeniable truth. You mattered far more than they allowed themselves to acknowledge. This process of remembering isn't instant. It unfolds in stages, quiet moments of reflection, sudden realizations in the middle of the day, emotional punches during sleepless nights. And the beauty of it is this: you didn't have to do anything but walk away. Your withdrawal became the catalyst for their awareness. The remembering is involuntary because the impact of your love wasn't shallow, it was imprinted. And now, with you gone, they're left sorting through the fragments of everything they once had and everything they may never get back. When you go missing, there's a shift in power. Not the kind that dominates or controls, but the kind that reclaims. You take back the emotional energy you were constantly pouring into someone who wasn't meeting you halfway. You stop filling the space they kept empty, and that change isn't subtle. It hits like a wave, because while you were present, they never had to face the silence, they never had to wonder, but now they're left with questions that echo louder than your presence ever did. They begin to wonder where you are, what you're doing, and more importantly, why you're no longer giving what you used to give so freely. This absence forces them to confront their own actions, or lack thereof. It acts like a mirror, reflecting back everything they didn't do, the unreturned calls, the ignored messages, the emotional distance. They all start to sting when there's no longer someone there absorbing it all without complaint. When you disappear from their world, you don't just create a void, you create a confrontation. They're left alone with their behavior, and for many people, that's uncomfortable. They begin to sense the emotional imbalance you endured for so long, but now they feel it from the other side. And that's where the real power lies, because without even speaking, you force a shift. You stop chasing, stop proving, stop giving to someone who only knew how to receive. You stop offering parts of yourself to someone who only gave you fractions in return. And that silence, that emotional boundary, becomes your loudest message. It says, I'm no longer available for half, love for one-sided effort, for relationships where I have to beg to be seen. Without saying a word, you set a new standard. It's not just about teaching them a lesson. It's about protecting your peace. When you constantly give to someone who doesn't give back, you drain your own emotional reserves. You burn yourself out trying to keep a connection alive that they're not willing to invest in. But when you walk away, when you go missing from that emotional equation, you refill your own cup. You come back to yourself, and in doing so, you raise your energy to a level that demands more, not because you're hard to please, but because you've finally realized what you deserve. And while they're busy worrying, remembering, regretting, you're rebuilding, not from bitterness, but from self-awareness. You're no longer trying to convince someone to appreciate your worth. You're letting your absence show them what your presence truly meant. And if they ever want to be part of your life again, it'll require more than empty words. It'll require changed behavior, real effort, and a recognition of the value they ignored for far too long. When you go missing from someone's emotional landscape, you interrupt their pattern. You break the cycle of them expecting you to always be there, always answering, always giving, always softening every sharp edge they threw at you. That interruption, it forces them to feel. And feelings they once buried, feelings they avoided through distraction or denial, start bubbling to the surface, because when someone who always cared suddenly stops, the shift isn't just noticed, it's felt deeply. And that's when something surprising happens. Fear sets in. They don't fear your anger. They don't fear a fight. They fear your indifference, because anger still means you care enough to react. But when you're missing, when you've gone silent, when you're no longer available in the way you used to be, that's when they realize they no longer have access to your emotions, your attention, or your heart. And that lack of access feels like a door slamming shut, without warning, without negotiation. It's not loud, but it's final, and in that silence they start to panic. This fear of losing you doesn't stem from entitlement alone. It stems from the subconscious realization that they mismanaged something valuable. They may not have known how much you were carrying until you set it all down. They may not have understood the emotional safety you brought until it disappeared. And now they're left with an emptiness they don't know how to fill. That fear drives them inward, makes them replay the timeline, search for where things shifted. And while they may have taken your presence for granted, your absence now dominates their emotional awareness. But this isn't about revenge. It's not about making someone suffer. It's about restoring balance. Because when someone realizes that your care, your energy, your love wasn't unconditional for the sake of being walked on, but rather it was a choice you made every day, they begin to understand the cost of their neglect. They begin to question their own behavior. They feel the sting of knowing they had something rare, something real, and they didn't treat it with the reverence it deserved. That's what your absence reveals. The beauty is, you didn't have to beg, you didn't have to scream, you simply left the space, you exited the dynamic that drained you, and in doing so, you ignited something more powerful than confrontation, reflection. That fear, that worry, that internal tension they now feel, that's the echo of your emotional presence. That's the realization that you were the one showing up while they were coasting. And now, without you to lean on, they're left to face the weight of everything they failed to give. When you go missing, emotionally, mentally, physically, from a connection that once consumed your energy, something subtle but powerful begins to happen inside the other person. Accountability begins to take root. At first, they might try to brush off your absence, telling themselves it's temporary, or that you'll be back like always. But as time passes and they realize you're not rushing back, not checking in, not pouring yourself into the empty spaces they used to leave, they're forced to sit with their choices. They start to see the dynamics for what they truly were, not a mutual connection, but a one-sided convenience. And that's where reflection leads to realization. They begin connecting dots they previously ignored. Maybe they remember the way your eyes used to light up when you spoke about your dreams, dreams they never asked about. Maybe they recall how you used to reach out during their tough days, efforts they never reciprocated. Suddenly, every small moment they once dismissed becomes significant. They realize your care wasn't random. It was consistent, deliberate, and rare. And the fact that it's now gone makes those memories heavier, more meaningful, and far more painful to ignore. Your absence starts acting like a mirror, not just showing them who you were, but who they failed to be. And that mirror doesn't lie. It reflects the complacency, the emotional laziness, the subtle taking for granted that they once excused as normal. Now they can't deny it. They can't rewrite the story to make themselves the hero. Because the story, now quiet, now still, feels incomplete without the person who once brought it to life, you, and that truth has a way of burning into their awareness in a way your presence never could. But here's the powerful part. While they're coming to these realizations, you're healing. You're not missing them from a place of longing. You're detaching from a place of wisdom. You're growing. You're reclaiming your emotional freedom. You're realizing that missing someone doesn't mean you need to return to them. It means you value the connection, but now you value yourself more. That clarity doesn't just change your relationship with them. It changes your relationship with yourself. You stop betraying your own needs for temporary comfort. You stop silencing your worth to hold on to someone afraid of recognizing it. And while they're finally seeing what they lost, you're finally seeing what you gained: peace, power, and perspective. You're no longer the one waiting, you're the one choosing your growth, choosing your boundaries, choosing your worth, and in doing so, you shift the story from one of absence to one of presence, your own. Because when you go missing from someone who took you for granted, you don't just leave a void in their world. You light a fire in your own. When you go missing, what truly begins to shift is the dynamic of emotional supply and demand. You were once readily available, offering love, support, presence, understanding, without hesitation. You were the emotional backbone of the connection, and that consistency created a certain level of emotional comfort for the other person. They didn't have to try hard. They didn't have to show up fully. They didn't have to invest deeply. Why? Because you were always there. But when you pull that presence back, when you stop giving, when you disappear from the space they got so used to, you instantly change the terms of the relationship, you create emotional scarcity, and suddenly your value skyrockets in their awareness. Scarcity wakes people up. When something or someone is always available, it's easy to overlook how precious it really is. But the moment it's gone, the mind fixates on it. It starts to remember all the details it once took for granted. That's exactly what happens when you go silent. You were once the constant, the one they could count on to answer, to understand, to care even when they didn't deserve it. Now that you're not showing up the same way, they begin to panic. Not because of you, but because of the loss of comfort they built around you, and here's where the emotional tables turn. They start wondering what you're thinking. They start checking your social media. They replay past conversations, looking for signs they missed. The silence they once ignored now speaks louder than any words ever could. Why? Because your absence isn't just about you being gone. It's about them feeling the weight of your absence and finally understanding the role you played. They may not say it out loud, but inside they feel it. And they begin to want what they didn't fight to keep when it was in front of them. Meanwhile, you're no longer caught in the loop of proving your worth. You've stopped negotiating for someone's effort. You've unplugged from the dynamic that once drained you, and this isn't coldness. It's clarity. You're reclaiming your time, your emotional energy, yourself. You realize that disappearing from someone's life isn't about playing games. It's about honoring yourself enough to walk away from places where you were constantly undervalued. In your disappearance, you become more powerful, not because you're trying to manipulate, but because you're finally centered, and that energy shift, that's magnetic. That's what they feel when they suddenly remember everything. The jokes, the warmth, the support, the way you understood them like no one else, it all floods back, and they're left wondering how they let it slip away. The truth is, silence carries a language of its own, one that speaks louder than any confrontation ever could. When you go missing from someone's life, you're not just stepping away physically. You're withdrawing the emotional presence they once relied on. That absence creates space, and in that space, awareness is born. They begin to notice the echo of your laughter, the comfort of your words, and the safety of your understanding. All those things they dismissed as normal now feel like luxuries they no longer have access to. And in that gap, they're forced to confront the reality of what they let slip through their fingers. Your disappearance triggers their memory because now they're dealing with stillness. No more validation, no more checking in, no more emotional cushions. Just the cold mirror of their own actions, or lack thereof. That's when the recollection begins. They remember the patience you extended, the way you always showed up, even on your worst days, the love you gave freely, the support you offered without asking for much in return. Suddenly, you aren't just someone they knew, you're someone they lost, and that realization cuts deep, because now they know that love like yours wasn't guaranteed, it was a gift, and it's no longer being given. But what matters even more is what you discover in your own absence. When you go missing from a dynamic that never poured back into you, you start to rediscover your wholeness. You realize that peace doesn't come from being understood by someone else. It comes from understanding yourself. You find strength not in being needed by someone else, but in needing nothing that costs you your self-respect. You stop waiting to be chosen because you've already chosen you, and that decision becomes the foundation of your freedom. The irony is, when they finally remember everything, You're no longer the same version of yourself who once needed to be remembered. You've evolved. You've created distance, not out of revenge, but out of wisdom. You've learned that you don't need to chase, convince, or prove. When you go missing and let the silence do the work, you give someone the opportunity to either rise or remain stuck, and you give yourself the permission to move forward with grace, clarity, and power. You've stopped showing up in spaces that made you question your worth, and that is where your true transformation begins. So let them remember, let them feel, let them finally see, but more importantly, you keep walking. You keep rising, you keep protecting your energy and your heart, because your value isn't in being available to everyone. It's in being deeply aligned with yourself. And the moment you realize that, you stopped being the one who was lost. You became the one who was finally found by you. Thank you for being here, for listening not just with your ears, but with your heart. If today's message touched something deep within you, that's no coincidence. It means you're ready to choose yourself, ready to let go of what no longer feeds your spirit, and ready to step into a version of you that no longer needs to beg to be seen, heard, or loved. Your presence in this space matters. And if no one's told you lately, you are powerful beyond measure. You don't need to overgive to earn affection. You don't need to keep showing up for someone who keeps forgetting your value. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away and trust that the right energy, the right people, and the right love will meet you on the path of your own healing. I hope today's words served as a mirror, a nudge, or maybe even a breakthrough. Remember, disappearing from someone's life isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming your peace, your strength, and your self-worth. And from that space, everything changes, not just what you attract, but how deeply you respect yourself. So thank you for your time, your trust, and your energy. Keep choosing you, keep growing, keep glowing, and keep standing tall in your truth. Until next time, take care of your heart, protect your peace. And goodbye for now.